Thank you for being here. If I haven't had the good fortune to meet you, my name is Kate Alexander. I'm Associate Director of Florida Studio Theater. Oh, thank you. My family's in the audience tonight. Thank you so much for being here. Today marks the very beginning of the projects and the program of the Suffragist Project for 2020. Thank you. If you don't know what that is, August 20th, 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. Absolutely. For the whole year, over 60 organizations are involved, serving over 30,000 people with free program, many of them like this tonight. During the whole year, and we will culminate in August with a giant celebration, we are going to celebrate, honor, and reveal the complexity of the Suffragist Project. That complexity can never be underestimated because the right to vote, which was earned in 2020, took a long time for it to be ratified again by all the states, and it wasn't until, I think, in the 60s that Florida ratified it. Think about it. In this complexity, we also want to draw attention. It's not just about a ballot, a right to vote. It means when you're at the table, you govern your life. You have the opportunity to enact the laws that reflect and govern your life. And still, there are people that cannot govern their own lives in our country. And it is no accident that I believe we start today with the rights of all and the LGBTQ community. And this is what we will investigate today, and hopefully throughout the year, people's consciousnesses will be awakened to say the rights of all matter, and we all have to be at the table equally. So, before we begin, I would like to draw our attention to that year in August of 2020. It took a long time to get there. 1920. Thank you. It took a long time to get there. Centuries, thousands of years of silence. And we know it wasn't until the 1700s that women were even allowed to speak. They couldn't speak publicly. So by the time we got to that vote and what it took, we're going to hearken back to a real speech of that time.
In the year of our Lord, 1916, the 14th of October. Sisters of the West, may we count on you. How can our nation be free with half of its citizens politically enslaved? Women of the West, stand by us in this crisis. Give us your help and we shall win. Fight on our side. And liberty shall be for all of us. For the first time in the world, women are asked to unite with women in a common cause. will you stand by? It's only for a little while. Soon the fight will be over. Victory is in sight. It depends on how we stand in this coming election. United or divided. Whether we shall win and whether we shall deserve to win. Together, we will stand shoulder to shoulder for the greatest principle the world has ever known, the right of self-government. We have no money, no elaborate organization, no one interested in our success except anxious-hearted women all over the country who cannot come to the battle lines themselves. Women of these states, unite! We have only our chains to lose and a whole nation to gain.
Yes, those words still ring true. We still have a nation to gain. And to start tonight, I would like to introduce the man who conceived of this panel, who is dedicated to diversity in our community, and who brought this to life together for us today, Mr. Dan Boxser.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening for those who could beat the traffic and get here. Thank you so much for coming. And what is amazing is we had originally anticipated that this forum would be next door with a small seating capacity. And we were told by Meg that it was sold out. So we told everybody not to come. She said, no. She said, no, the Gompertz is sold out. It just shows the interest of this issue. And we want to thank the Florida Studio Theater for allowing us, and especially Kate Alexander, for allowing us to put on this first program in the Suffragist Project. Lytton and I are so grateful for the Florida Studio Theater allowing us to support students to come for so many provocative plays that they put on. And now I would like to introduce Judge Charles Williams, the moderator, who will introduce the guests.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. It's always a joy to moderate these types of conversations. Let me just give you some ground rules before I bring the panelists up. Even though we're in this formal setting, this beautiful backdrop, which I personally ordered for this event, by the way, I want you to think of being basically at a cocktail party at my house. I don't have a living room quite this big, but that's how intimate that I want this conversation to be, and that's how we discuss this with the panel that is about to appear on stage. The format is going to be a dialogue between the panelists and myself about the suffrage movement, and then we are going to progress into what's occurring in our country today. And so at some point we will open this up for a question and answer period with you. There will be mics on both sides of the auditorium, and I want you to really think about some of the things that you have wanted to talk about and publicly, because you will have that opportunity. So at this point, I'm going to bring out the panel. Now, we have two doctors and a dean, okay? If I slip back and forth and call them by their first names, please forgive me. They have given each other and myself permission to do that. So if that happens, it's no disrespect to any of the panelists. I told them they don't have to call me judge. I won't necessarily call them doctor or dean. But I would like to bring out the panelists, and as I call your names, if you will come out, the first panelist is Dr. Timothy McCarthy. Dr. McCarthy. The next panelist will be Dean Jolady Rosario. Dean Rosario. And then our final panelist will be Dr. Amy Reed. Now, all of you have in your program the complete biography of our panelists, and so I would ask that you refer to the biography, but briefly, starting from my left and proceeding again towards my left. Dr. McCarthy is an award-winning scholar and educator, public servant, and social justice activist who has taught at the Harvard University since 2005. Dean Gelady Rosario has recently joined Ringling College as the new Associate Dean of Students and Director of Diversity and Inclusion in order to establish Ringling's new Center for Diversity and Inclusion. And Dr. Amy Reed, at the end, is Professor of French and Gender Studies, and I believe heads the Gender Studies program at New College, and is currently on sabbatical and has taken her time to be present and be a part of this panel. So that is our panel. Again, for the full biography, please refer to your program. So let me just again tell you that the format really is going to be informal. I'm going to talk to the panelists as I would, like I said, at a cocktail party, but we're going to deal with some big words and some big terms. But I don't want anybody to be afraid. There's no math. You're not going to be tested on this. But we're going to start with the title of this program. The subtitle of this program contains within it the term intersectionality. Intersectionality is defined as being, quote, the recognition of the interconnected nature of various social identities such as race, class, and gender. It is hoped that through an awareness of intersectionality, we can better acknowledge and understand the differences among us. And there are other definitions of intersectionality, but from an article that I actually saw today, I just want to quote from it. There may not be a word in American conservatism more hated right now than intersectionality. On the right, intersectionality is seen as, quote, the new caste system, unquote, placing non-white, non-heterosexual people on top. To many conservatives, intersectionality means, quote, because you're a minority, you get special standards, special treatment in the eyes of some. It tells you how oppressed you are. It tells you what you're allowed to say, what you're allowed to think. Intersectionality is thus, quote, really dangerous, unquote, or a conspiracy theory of victimization. So I'm going to ask each panelist to give me their definition of intersectionality in the context of the topic tonight. So I'll start with my left, Dr. McCarthy.
Thank you very much, Judge. It's great to be here. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here tonight. The first thing I want to say in response to that is if people are so upset about a word that they may or may not understand, you should pay attention to it because it's probably important. Kimberly Crenshaw is the trailblazing legal scholar who first coined that term in 1989 in a law review article and then subsequently has written about it in many different ways since then. And what she, if you read her work, understood intersectionality to be was a way to analyze, specifically within the law and law that seeks to address issues of discrimination. It's a way for us to understand not only interlocking identities, that all of us exist in the world at the intersection of identities of race and class and gender and sexuality and ability and nationality, etc., but also as a way to understand how we are all positioned because of those realities differently in the world. Because we all exist within systems of power, systems of inequality, and systems of oppression. And so for me, when I think about intersectionality as Kim Crenshaw, who coined the term, understands it, it's both as a way to understand the complexity and multitudinous nature of our lived experience, but also as a way to analyze the interlocking systems of power, inequality, and oppression within which all of us are positioned. Some of us are on the upside of those systems of domination, and some of us are on the downside of that. Now, one other quick thing before before I pass over is that though the term intersectionality was coined by Kim Crenshaw in '89, this is an idea, an expression of lived experience and analysis that dates back to the 18th and 19th century, where black women abolitionists were talking about the double burden or the double bind of race and gender as enslaved women, often mothers taken away from their families, ripped from their families and subjected to sexual abuse as part of the architecture of oppression of slavery. You see it again articulated in the Combahee River Collective statement in 1977 by a group of black feminists who talked about intersectionality without using the word. And so Kim Crenshaw, though she coined that term, stands in a long genealogy of black women who are positioned in different eras and different ways in society, who have given us this rich understanding of these experiences and this analysis.
Okay, Dean?
I don't know how to follow that. I think that was pretty comprehensive. I was going to talk a little bit about the Combahee River Collective, who you expressed actually were the ones who actually first wrote a statement to explore these ideas that really talked about not only sort of racial oppression, but also thinking about gender identity. And that was one of the first black feminist, but also lesbian group, right? And we are talking about LGBTQ sort of movements. And that was the first time that we can see black women who are part of the LGBT community really developing language and really being really critical around these thoughts around what does it mean to live in the intersections when you have multiple identities and multiple ways that you're being oppressed, depending on where you stood in the social ladder. I think personally, that is a word, when I think about intersectionality, I think about the personal impact that I receive as a queer person, as a trans person, as a person of color. And I think we often then get in between these battles of debate of the oppression Olympics, right? Like, who is more oppressed? And I think the problem with that then is that then we are trying to minimize the human experience of oppression rather than really listening to the person, right? So instead of thinking, oh, this is about oppression Olympics, no, we're thinking about what are the multiple identities that this person holds that society-wise, they're impacted in so many different ways, and that has a compounding effect, whether it is in your mental health, in your spiritual health, if you're a spiritual person, in your well-being, your everyday, right? Because we all live with things like self-care, depression, and things like that. So these are multiple ways that we're impacted, right? And oftentimes we're just thinking about intention. And you know, one of the things that I want us to get through when we get to these arguments is to get past the intention. I didn't mean to say that. No, but that person is impacted in so many different levels, and that's where we need to start understanding in order to develop that human connection, right? And so that's when I think about intersection is how can we think about the compounding effects on someone's identity and how they're oppressed in multiple ways and how we could only maybe sometimes see one, right? So I'm probably up here, and some people are like, probably thinking two things. One, that I might be racially ambiguous, which I get a lot, or that I am queer, right? But you're not thinking about other identities that might be invisible to what you see, right? And I think intersectionality also gets to those blind identities that is not visible to the eye, right? So if you have someone like myself, Black and Hispanic up here, you might be able to identify that, right? Based on visual and appearance. But I think intersectionality is looking at not just the physical, but also the invisible identities that we don't get to see and really talk about, such as invisible disabilities and things like that. So that's what I would add to your long history.
Thank you. Great. Dr. Reed.
Well, hello, everyone. I think it's a challenging position to be coming third in this. So if I'm going to add anything to it, I guess what I want to say, one, if we're going to start with intersectionality, yes, Kim Crenshaw, yes, the Combahee Collective, also Sojourner Truth, right, with the Ain't I a Woman speech, which might be one of the first real articulations of that position. But I think the thing that I want to emphasize is that what intersectionality does is it allows us to understand that identity is not about an either or a type of singular banner that any of us walks under, but it reflects the additive nature of our identities. Our religion, our class, our sexual orientation, our position in our families, our wealth. where we're from, our education, all of these different things, our abilities, affect our identity and affect how we walk in the world. If we're thinking about social movements, an understanding of intersectionality does reveal challenges that we have about making coalitions, but it also allows us to start thinking about the possibility of coalition building. And unless we start understanding that people do walk differently in this world, each of us individually, we're not going to be able to come up with the types of coalitions that we need to affect positive change in our society. So I think intersectionality gives us a positive tool.
All right, thank you. And, you know, we only have 35 minutes. And then we're going to give you about 30 minutes or so for Q&A. The suffrage movement is an extremely complex issue. It involves issues of not only gender, but race and politics and power. We could spend days really talking about it. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the history of the suffrage movement. I'd like to move that a little bit into the modern feminist movement. Then I think that there are some issues that are going on today, issues that are pending in front of our legislatures, in front of our Supreme Court, here locally, that I'd like to touch on because it's all interrelated and interconnected to the things that occurred years ago during the suffrage movement. So I want to briefly just talk about some issues that impacted the suffrage movement from the beginning. And certainly as you go through the calendar, we will have separate discussions on the issues of how African American women were treated by the suffrage movement, how the fact that African American men got the vote before white women and how that impacted the suffrage movement in terms of politics, the resentment that some of these white women, some of whom we are honoring, really, that were resentful and said some very, very hateful things about African American men who got the vote before them. And ultimately, the suffrage movement influenced the modern feminist movement. So it's a very deep history in terms of how we got here. But I would like to start with Dr. Reed, because Dr. Reed and I have had this conversation about how the modern feminist movement sort of took root or evolved in the suffrage movement. And I'd like to start this part of the conversation with Dr. Reed.
So when we were talking yesterday in preparation for this panel, one of the things that came up was considering the suffrage movement not as something that is encompassed by 1920, but something that spans from the middle of the 19th century through to the 1960s or so. So that the suffrage movement started in the 1800s with pushes for women's property rights. A lot of the early suffragists were also members of abolition movements. And so there was a twinning of those two programs for social justice. As we move through after the Civil War, Judge Williams is correct in pointing out that there was an unfortunate and regrettable expression of racism on the part of some of the suffragists who were frustrated that their elite votes were not recognized before the rights of African American men to vote. We do also need to recognize that although the right to vote was given, it didn't necessarily make much of a difference for people in the way that they were able to exercise those rights until much later. And I think we'll probably be talking a little bit about the Voting Rights Act as our conversation goes on. If we think, though, about suffrage as sort of the first wave of feminism, you can see in it a move towards an understanding of the challenges of what we're going to be talking about as intersectionality, in that after the turn of the 20th century, in the early 19-teens, the suffragists themselves were recognizing that they needed to reach out to working class women, to immigrant women, Jewish women, Catholic women, African American women, and bring more people into the fold and into the discussion about women's rights and women's position in society. So while we can question certainly some of the errors of that movement, the push for people, in particular, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, Stanton Blatch, who really made an effort to make sure that the voices of working women were heard as part of the suffrage movement. I think we can get a sense of people moving towards a broader understanding of what the right to vote would mean for people. It's not just a symbolic access to vote, but it's a way of exercising your voice and ensuring that your needs in terms of class supports and workers' rights were recognized as well.
Dean or Doctor, any additional historical footnotes that you think it's important to bring out as we talk about this intersectionality?
I was going to add that one of the things that I think is interesting, and I think you highlighted as well as you, Judge, just thinking about the now in connection to the suffrage movement. It's just interesting to look at sort of the tensions with all of these movements across time. So if we look at the suffrage movement, for example, when we look at abolitionists, we can see that there was a lot of parallels in terms of trying to see how to move forward, trying to get the right to vote, and then also having this sort of anger when Black men were allowed to vote with the 15th Amendment. And so we see a lot of kind of rifts between communities and the separation between Black communities and white communities, particularly with white women in there. And if we progress further down the line, we see kind of the same kind of tensions in the civil rights movement with the LGBTQ movement, where we have sort of maybe white elites or white folks who are leading the LGBTQ movement, and they're using civil rights movement kind of policies and laws and regulations and even language, even in the front steps of DC, where they're also trying to be like, hey, if the Black community can have equal rights, then this is the same thing that we need for our LGBTQ folks. And if we look at, for example, Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin. So a lot of people may know MLK, right? Everybody knows MLK, his birthday's coming up, but we don't really hear about Bayard Rustin, right? And Bayard Rustin was an LGBTQ activist who actually taught a lot of the lessons that came about that we know MLK, what we know MLK for sort of nonviolence, civil disobedience, thinking about all of those kind of aspects that we think. And then when we think about the Washington, D.C. march, we always think about the I Have a Dream speech. What we fail to talk about is how Bayard Rustin, a queer Black man, was actually the organizer of the entire march, who put that together and got all of those folks together and invited King to come and do that speech. And so we see this continuous erasure of different people who are marginalized based on the times and what's happening. And we see that kind of progressively throughout time continues to happen. So what is the most prevalent and what is it that we want to move? What is the agenda that we want to kind of move forward? And so we sacrifice maybe some folks' rights on one hand while we progress with another one, whether that was a reality or not, because we also know that after the men were allowed to vote by legal standards, there were also other things that came around from literacy sort of testings and poll taxes and et cetera, that really didn't allow men to exercise that right. So it's interesting when we think about these movements that the coalitions, even when people are in coalition, there's also tensions within, depending on who actually gets to move forward when something is passed. And so that's something that I think will come about in our conversation, thinking about the tensions between movements.
Yeah, I think co-sign on all of that. And one of the things that I just want to add a couple things. One is that I think it's really important in these moments of celebration, commemoration, interrogation. I like to call these sort of milestone moments opportunities for reckoning with our history and how our history or past bears down on the present and beckons the future. And so this year is not only the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which we know as giving women the right to vote, even though that was a much, much more complicated story. Women could vote in New Jersey as late as 1807 or as early as 1807 before they changed the property requirements. There were a number of states in the North where women could vote before Seneca Falls Convention. Women were voting in about 70% of American states before Congress passed the 19th Amendment and before the big drive for ratification that led to 1920 being added to the Constitution. So the story about one moment or even one movement is always way more complicated. And so I like to take these moments, 100th anniversary, as moments of interrogation. And I said the same thing last year when I had the honor of being the special guest editor of the nation's 50th anniversary interrogation and reckoning, which we called it Reclaiming and Reckoning with Stonewall, of the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion, which itself is a moment that helps to spark and shape a movement. But that story is much more complicated for the reasons that you just mentioned. And so I don't want us just to celebrate, and certainly I'm a historian and I'm an activist, so I don't do a lot of celebrating in America right now. Like, I celebrate not an America that we're going back to again, but an America that we have yet to radically reimagine together. And then I also want to say, because I think it's important, that the US Constitution does not explicitly state or give any of us the right to vote. If you read, and this is like one of the only times I'm going to be an originalist of the Constitution, but if you read the original Constitution, that Constitution, even if it includes the Bill of Rights, which it needed to add, those 10 amendments, First Amendments needed to add to get the ratification through, it doesn't give us explicitly the right to vote. It lays out how we elect representatives to House of Representatives and the Senate, how we elect our president. It talks about all sorts of elections and electoral politics and representation and all of these things, but it doesn't actually explicitly guarantee any of us the right to vote. That came piecemeal through local and state campaigns over time, of which the suffrage movement was a very important part. But it came in fits and starts and ebbs and flows. It didn't come in waves, but really sort of choppy seas, as one of my colleagues likes to refer to it. That the 15th Amendment gives black men ostensibly the right to vote, and the 19th Amendment gives women ostensibly the right to vote, but that's just the surface of the story. This story is much, much more complicated. So I'd encourage all of us when we're having these kinds of moments to understand that the history of the right to vote is not given to us as an origin birthright, right? Citizenship itself has changed in terms of its meaning over time and is being changed right today in our current political system. And so too is the right to vote, which is why we must always remain sort of critical about how we approach it and also open-eyed about what we're talking about.
Okay, from that historical perspective and the vantage point now of looking back, I thought it was very interesting before the panelists and myself came out that Kate told you that it wasn't until the 1960s, it was actually 1969 that Florida ratified the 19th Amendment.
Why hurry?
But here's the good news if you're from the South. It was actually Tennessee in 1920 that gave them the 38th state to put it over. Right.
That's right.
So that's an interesting point to bring out. So let's take a look at where we are now and talk about some of the issues. And I'd like to start out, I was trying to think, okay, how do I bridge this into what's going on now? And go out and let the dog out, take a look at the morning paper. I'm going through the sports section first, as I tend to do. And then there's this headline. And if you have not read today's Sarasota Herald Tribune in the local section, perhaps in anticipation of today's forum, today's headline in the Sarasota Herald Tribune reads this way: Locals to push for Sarasota County LGBTQ anti-discrimination ordinance. The cities of Sarasota, Northport, and Venice have all passed LGBTQ anti-discrimination ordinances over the last decade or so. Sarasota County has not. Advocates, some of whom may be here tonight, argue that although there are some protections by the federal and state constitutions, that still leaves 60% of residents outside of these cities vulnerable to discrimination based on gender and sexual orientation. So, 19th Amendment passed in 1920. We're 100 years on the anniversary, and we're still struggling with this issue of universal acceptance. So I'd like to get the panelists' thoughts about that issue, about the fact that, Sarasota, the city of Sarasota has passed this ordinance. Venice has passed this ordinance, Northport, but the county, which tends to be a little bit more conservative overall, if you follow the demographics, has not. So just any general thoughts about that? And I'll ask the dean to give her thoughts about it, since she's the newest resident of Sarasota County.
I think that was a setup. I'm still learning about Sarasota. I come from New York City. The Bronx, any Bronx? Okay, yeah. And so I think that with me traveling from New York City and even living in Jersey when I worked at Rutgers and thinking about, I'm gonna hit all the states by the time we're done because I've traveled a lot. But I think that coming from what most folks considered very progressive states, whether it is around LGBTQ sort of rights, if it is about immigration rights. For example, Rutgers just actually hired a lawyer for undocumented students to be able to have legal representation with everything that was happening. And then I went to Arizona. And it's very difficult to think about me as a trans person of color moving to very progressive spaces where in New Jersey, I don't necessarily have a fear of going to a restroom, right? I can go to Starbucks, I can go to McDonald's, I can go to a school, and I know that I have some sort of legal protection. When I go into a place like Arizona, I have to think about my life before I pee. And to even think about it in that way is very cynical, but at the same time, it really is life-threatening. And I'm Black, right? But if someone is a darker sister or a darker brother, then they even have more life-threatening things that they have to think about before they walk down the street. And so in Sarasota, and thinking about my move to Florida, I think that was a really big thought in terms of thinking about what does safety look like for me personally in a state that I'm unfamiliar with, in a place that is conservative, right? And I don't think being conservative is bad. It's just there's some conservative ties that feel dangerous for my life, right? And so thinking about that, I always have to negotiate not just my safety, but my family's safety. I have a 8-month-old, I have an 11-year-old, and I'm no longer thinking about my safety alone in terms of just using a restroom, but I'm thinking about the impact that it's going to have on my family. So in terms of my thoughts, I think it's time. I think that if you look at what's happening in the world, there's so many things happening that are being progressive, and I think America right now is scared. They're scared of the shift. I think there's a lot of generational shifts in terms of language, of how we are viewing the world, of how people are trying to create progressive thoughts that feel inclusive because they've been left out for hundreds of years, as we can see as reflected in this conversation. And I think it's time that we move forward, right?
And what I'd like to do also, as we are talking about things that are occurring in 2020 and recently, I'm going to play the devil's advocate a little bit on the issues that have come up over these types of ordinances, which have been passed by local legislatures all over the country. And some people make the argument that by expanding these protections, you're infringing upon the rights of individuals, you're infringing upon the rights of businesses, and you're forcing them to compromise their personal or religious beliefs. And of course, the best example of that is the Colorado case. And that's the Colorado cake case, the wedding cake case. And if you're not familiar with that case, the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, ruled in favor of a Colorado baker who refused to bake a cake to celebrate the marriage of a same-sex couple because of a religious objection. In that case, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission showed hostility towards the baker based on his religious beliefs. Justice Kennedy, no longer on the court, wrote in the opinion, and it was a 7-2 opinion, so 7 justices agreed with Justice Kennedy. Part of his opinion, he is quoted as saying, religious and philosophical objections to gay marriage are protected views and in some instances protected forms of expression. So I'd like to get the panelists' thoughts on that, and I'll start with Dr. McCarthy.
So the first thing I want to say is that this is the next wave of the culture wars in the United States. And it is beginning, it has been percolating, it is now in full bloom, and here we are again. And so that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing is that there are 3 court cases at the Supreme Court pending right now on a more conservative Supreme Court. One of the things that's ironic and tragically so about Justice Kennedy's opinion in the Masterpiece Cake case is that Justice Kennedy was and is and will remain in history a great champion for the most part of LGBT rights as a justice on the Supreme Court. He wrote the majority opinion on some of the most landmark cases, including the Obergefell case, which gave me and my husband and so many other same-sex couples the right to get married. And so that being his last major LGBT case is a certain tragic historical irony there that will always be a footnote to his legacy. And I can't imagine he isn't somewhat troubled by that. But the Supreme Court this spring, in a series of cases, a series of rulings, is going to rule whether or not it is okay, legally okay, constitutionally okay to discriminate against LGBT people for a variety of reasons. And the Masterpiece Cake ruling will be one of the precedents that they look at for that. And these are interesting cases because for the most part, equal rights cases in the United States, you know this much better than I do, so correct me if I'm wrong, I know you will. The equal rights cases at the federal level often hinge on the 14th Amendment, which, departing from my originalism, was amended to the Constitution, 14th Amendment, after the Civil War, one of the 3 major amendments to transform the Constitution into a more equitable and egalitarian and libertarian Constitution, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, abolishing slavery, establishing equal protection under the law, and then the suffrage, the voting rights amendment for black men. And the equal rights claims that LGBT people make and that many other groups make, people of color in affirmative action cases and so forth, are based on the 14th Amendment. And it's interesting because we now see something that's emerging in our jurisprudence of a First Amendment versus 14th Amendment culture war. That there are folks who are saying that they have the First Amendment right to religious freedom, which then allows them the right to discriminate against people who are LGBTQ, whether they're queer for reasons of sexual orientation or gender identity expression or all of the above, whether or not that the court is going to give them the right to do that. And so we have a really interesting kind of celebrity death match or constitutional death match between the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment. Religious conservatives who are claiming First Amendment rights to discriminate and LGBTQ people who are saying that no, under the 14th Amendment, we deserve equal protection under the law. And that's what we're dealing with right now in the courts. In culture, we're going to have to fight this in different ways because most of us do not argue cases before the Supreme Court. Most of us do not serve on the Supreme Court or write the opinions of the Supreme Court. And most of us are not plaintiffs or defendants in Supreme Court cases. Most of us live in the world of the United States, which is, again, in the crosshairs of a culture war. And so for me, when I fight those battles, which I've been fighting my entire adult life as a queer person, as an activist in lots of realms, I always say, okay, if you have a religious claim to discriminate against me, you got to tell me what that is, because I know Jesus too. I grew up Catholic. I went to CCD class. I read the Bible as a child, and then again as a doctoral student, because I had to read the St. James Version of the Bible to understand what the abolitionists were talking about in all of their pamphlets that I was writing about my dissertation. So I read the Bible a couple times. usually when I get in these culture war issues, twice as many, two times more than some of the people I'm fighting with who are making those religious claims. And so I always ask them to find some Jesus for me to justify the claim to discrimination, because it's very hard to find the Jesus. It's very easy to go back to the Old Testament, but it's the New Testament that makes Christians Christian. And so if you're going to come at me with your religious claims about discrimination, then I'm going to come back at you with my understanding of Jesus, Christianity, and the Bible, and we're going to have that battle, and that's one of the battles we're having now, and may the best person win.
Okay.
It's funny because I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about where I got my degree at, which was Messiah College. Can't get more Christian than that.
All right, wow. I defer.
What I'd like to do, and we're going to go through a couple of more cycles of questions, and then I think we're going to probably open it up to some Q&A. And I'm going to direct this to Dean Rosario. There's a local Sarasota case that has implications currently in the U.S. Supreme Court, which Dr. McCarthy alluded to, concerning a growing issue of how Sarasota schools are dealing with transgender issues. The issue first came up in Sarasota in 2016 when a transgender student at Pineview School was denied requests to use the male bathroom. There were protests. Students at the school pushed Pineview and the Sarasota County School Board to change its policy. To its credit, the results ultimately were that the school board decided that each school will have at least one universal bathroom, but no student will be forced to use it. Transgender students will be addressed by the names and pronouns requested, even if they do not match official records. And I know as a dean of a college, you deal with these types of issues probably more so than most people. So what are your thoughts about that? And that whole issue of policies and adjustments for transgender and the use of pronouns and language?
So I actually don't use she and her pronouns. I use z's or zers. I identify as trans. So I think that my response, depending on where you're at, it's sort of like I'm a part of that crowd. I am the person who gets impacted by a lot of those policies. And so rightly so, I am in support of those policies because of things that I experience in my own life, which I referenced violence. And I'll tell you a personal story a little bit later on. So a lot of the work that I do is exactly creating institutional policies, inclusive restroom policies that students could utilize on a college or collegial level in order to be able to have the right when they do face discrimination just for trying to use the restroom. Not only in the restrooms, but also thinking about gender inclusive housing on a college level, which obviously in pre-K, we're not necessarily wrestling with the idea of where you're gonna be sleeping at and who's gonna be your roommate. So there's a lot of compounding different policies that we're dealing with, as well as creating registration forms, thinking about how a professor is referencing a student in the classroom. And we do a lot of safe zone training to educate the community around what does it mean to be a part of the LGBT community, what is the LGBTQ history, then thinking about what are progressive ways or things that you can do to make someone feel included. It's not about even being progressive, it's just being human and allowing that person to feel comfortable in your presence. And it's really that simple. Sometimes we make it political, but it's about making sure that that person feels that they're a part and that they're a part of your community. And so oftentimes I plea and ask professors and staff to think about, you have a curriculum, you have a business card, you have an email, put your pronouns there, right? So that students know that you are a safe space or a person that I can go and speak to. If you have name tags, put your pronouns on it so that you can do that and be a presence and be someone that is showcasing allyship. So I am very for creating spaces. I think it's difficult because you also have legal codes in terms of how many restroom stalls you need for a particular place, depending on how many. So it doesn't only become this sort of institutional struggle of what is right and what is wrong, but it's also sort of a legal battle based on, and a financial battle, right? Because then if you have to remodel a restroom, that's gonna require capital. And to build just one restroom can go anywhere between $35,000 to $100,000 to build one stall for someone. So I can understand in terms of financial pressure, what does that mean to be inclusive for folks? But that shouldn't be the reason why we don't do it, because we build new buildings all the time. But in you thinking about it too, for example, at Ringling, right now we are having that discussion. We do have gender inclusive restrooms. We have a number of buildings that have been identified that can meet city codes, that we can open up to students. And then there are buildings that we can't. So I'm in a building that I have to go to 2 or 3 buildings down to pee if I want to use a gender inclusive restroom, or I have to go into the women's restroom and then have this awkward kind of conversation with some people. So this is where the insert story here. So I was traveling in Arizona, going to New York, and I didn't have, where I was at in the airport, I didn't have a gender inclusive restroom or a family restroom, because if I see a family restroom, I'm like, there. I love family restrooms. And when I went inside, I was traveling with a dog, and I didn't have a relief area for the dog. So I had to be like, I don't know where I'm going to let you pee. So I had a little pee pad. I put it down. I had a little cute Yorkie. He's 4 pounds. He's not going to pee a lot, so this is good. So I walk in, and if we pretend that this line is the restroom, there's a hallway, and then there's all the restroom stalls. So right here, there's like a little cove, and I was like, that is a perfect spot for my dog to pee. And so I put the little pee pad, and I had this woman come in, and she kind of comes in and goes like this. And then I was like, oh, if you're looking for the restroom stalls, you just got to keep walking that way. And she looked at me and said, I don't understand why they let people like you here. I'm not going to tell you what I said back, because it probably wouldn't be professional of me to do so. But when you think about those moments, it's scary, right? Because I don't know what that person's reaction is going to be. And if I go to a men's restroom, I've had those interactions as well. The message is, why are you in this restroom? So really, I have nowhere else to pee except to hold my bladder until I get home, which, thank God, all of our homes have gender-neutral restrooms.
With that, Kate Alexander has agreed to be our audience question and answer moderator, and she will give you the rules of engagement if you have a question, and I can give you this mic if you need one. Okay.
A guy did it for me. Thank you. All right, here's our ground rules. Please try to frame it in a question. And please stand. And Alex is going to help me. He's going to be on this side. If you have a question for our panel, does anyone have a question? I'll start over here. And would you please stand?
So actually, my question is this, because you talk about intersectionality, and I am a social worker, so I work with multiple populations, and I hear discrimination and biases all the time. One of the things that they ask me is, why should they care? Why should they be interested in making somebody else feel comfortable? And this comes from all races, all communities, and I'm not really sure how to answer that, because it's very difficult. Why should I care that somebody wants to have a different bathroom? Why can't they just make it easy on everybody else? Why can't I say, if I have a business, that I don't want to bake a cake for somebody? You understand what I'm saying? So that's a real issue for me on a regular basis. So if you could help with that, I would appreciate it.
Part of the way that prejudice and fear and loathing and oppression works is the projection of something that you're free to do too onto a minoritized and marginalized population as their burden. Right? So the idea, like, why should I make it easier for them? Why don't they make it easier for us? What they're saying, you've just heard one story. We could all tell, we could be up here all night telling stories, all 4 of us, I'm sure, and everyone in this room. about those moments that are insulting and disrespectful and dehumanizing and devaluing. And if someone is saying, look, to the impact piece that you're talking about before, regardless of the intention, although the intention in your story is clear that was meant to dehumanize, there's no ambiguity there. If someone is saying to you, look, I'm uncomfortable, I feel disrespected, I don't feel seen, right? This is not a space where I feel safe, right? And that's not just some jingle or some buzzword. It means that I feel unsafe in this space. Then it's incumbent upon the people who are in control of that space to try to change it, right? The burden is not on the people who are saying to you, I feel unsafe here, in my opinion, right? And I said this last year. We talked about the language of racism last year, and we got talking about pronouns and how we refer to people based on identity. And I teach and I do a lot of stuff in education and a lot of stuff in community organizing spaces and social movement spaces. And when someone tells me that they want to be referred to as this, then I refer to them as this, because it's a fundamental act of respect. If someone says to you, this is what I would like to be called and how I would like to be referred to, and you don't do that, that's your burden, right? Not yours, but the person who's refusing to do that. And that, to me, is part of what is broken about this society. The call for gender-neutral bathrooms is not what's broken about this society. The fact that people willfully misgender and dehumanize trans people and non-binary people and queer people every single minute of every single day, here and in all the places you've mentioned that we've lived and traveled, that to me is the crisis. That to me is the problem. So I always try to frame it as a respect thing. Right? You want to be respected, I want to be respected. This goes back to the golden rule, the Jesus thing, right? Like, treat your neighbors as you want to be treated. It's not that complicated. Every faith tradition, by the way, has an articulation of that, every one that I know of. Anyway, and that to me is where it's at. So it's not about like, why do these people want me to change? It's like, they're asking you to respect them. So do it.
Okay, next question.
Another question.
Somebody up front here, and then we'll get the other question.
I want to thank you for being here. How can you keep a positive attitude about the cases coming before the Supreme Court when we have such a negative body of people as a whole who are not necessarily in support of your perspectives? And you can't really judge what's going to come out of there, but it is going to be very politically driven, especially in the current environment. How do you keep a positive view and try to bring it there when you might not get what you're hoping for?
I've learned that it's okay to cry in my pillow. I think that I've developed tools, and it took me a very long time to know what those were, healthy tools for me, personally, of self-care. Whether it is going for a drive at the racetrack or spending time with my family, particularly with my sons, because I travel so often, that I've developed just self-care tools. And then there's just those venting moments over wine where you get the people around the table and you just vent and cry about all of the things, and that you can feel that you're in community and you're not alone. And I think that I use those moments to celebrate who I am. And I continue doing the work that I do. I get up in the next day in the morning to continue to create inclusive spaces for all of my students, whether they're conservative, whether they're liberal, whether they're LGBTQ, right? That we all want a place to belong. And so my job is to create that, even if it's not being given to me. And that's a hard road to walk, but I have to walk it with pride and with a head up, and knowing that there's going to be some moments that I get stabbed in the back, but I have to get back up because my kids are coming after me. And I want to make sure that when I leave, that they have something to be proud of, that they have a parent that they can be proud of, that try to stand up for something in this world and make meaning of that. And so I have to laugh. And I think that we always talk about Black joy in our community, and that's the one thing that cannot be stolen. It's our joy and our proud and our family and our values to learn how to be happy and not let that be taken away. I think that's when you really hit rock bottom, when you can't stand back up.
And our final question, Alex, we get that right in the back there.
Thank you. I'd like to take it to another contemporary issue, and that's the whole #MeToo movement. And I'd be very curious to see how any or all of you see this in line of all of these other movements we've talked about. Obviously, all of these women coming forward and speaking up about something that has been happening to women probably forever in silence is incredibly threatening to the male power structures. It's in line with many of these movements. There's talk of a backlash. I would just love your thoughts on kind of how you see this in the history and where it might be going.
I'm going to actually ask Dr. Reed to address that issue as chair of the Gender Studies Department at New College.
So it's hard to separate these questions out, right? And part of the way I want to answer your question is to come back to your question about how do you keep on facing the day-to-day with the realization that we're not always moving forward, but there's a lot of pushback against our walking in the world, right? At the moment, the Me Too movement has changed the way that we're talking about sex and sexuality. It is removing barriers that prevented people from talking about sexual abuse. We think of women as the primary victims of sexual abuse, but according to some statistics, 10% of our young men will be sexually assaulted before they're 18. And so as a mother with sons, that is something that I worry about too, right? The Me Too movement is international. In France, they call it balance ton porc. Give up your pig. So as a way of trying to recognize the pervasiveness of sexual harassment. It's great. French is great for expression.
It really is. I said I need to learn French. I just said that.
But I think one of the challenges of the Me Too movement is that we can see the backlash against it, right? And I mean, currently in France, there's a case going on where there's an author who for 20 years has been openly talking about his pedophilic tendencies. He wrote a book about those under 16, right? Specifically girls, but not exclusively. And this is a person who has been lauded on the French literary stage. And right now, he is having to face his Me Too movement. One of his young proteges, shall we say, has now written a book talking about his exploitation of her. And still, there are people who are defending him, prominent men, prominent women in the literary and academic fields who are supporting this person. So we're going to have back and forths about it. If Me Too is opening up some spaces for the recognition of the pervasiveness, unfortunately, of sexual assault in our society, we're also going to be hearing a dismissal of that. And the people who are brave enough to speak out are going to get pushback against their truths. So we have to keep going.
I would love to add to this a little bit to tie it back to the suffragist movement. If we're looking at the suffragist movement and we're looking at folks like Susan B. Anthony and we're looking at sort of the foundation, it wasn't just the right to vote, right? There were a number of different things that this women's movements were fighting for, which was having the rights to your own body, including sex. Because before that, I think once you got married, the legal term was ceased to exist. Right? So a woman would cease to exist, which means you have no more rights to tell your husband no when you were having sex and things like that. So when I think about the Me Too movement, there's still a tie there of a continued struggle that has been happening for hundreds of years in terms of what is the right to what is the right of a woman to her own body, right? And now we're expanding that to really think about it also on a racial scale, because what we see in the Me Too movement is we have black women who started the movement, and then they get erased 10 years later. It gets coined as hashtag Me Too. And then now we have to reintegrate back the people who even started that hashtag to support other women, right? So again, we see those same echoes of erasure of the black community being erased from a movement that's moving forward. And I think, to one of the points that you said, is also thinking about the integration of black men, or just men experiences within that, which we have Terry Crews, for example, who expressed, a lot of the struggles that he experienced in Hollywood, and also being told by even his own peers, well, you have muscles to punch him, why you didn't just punch him, right? So now we're also thinking about what is the violence that men, particularly men of color as well, are facing in these industries that are also told to be silence, right? And silence has also a compounding effect in terms of the mental health, right? And so now we are integrating and making that I think with the Me Too movement, we're expanding that language to actually start considering, because men also have experienced rape and have experienced violence, and we need to talk about that because men are taught not to, particularly in communities of color, right? And I think that that's really important in terms of expanding that conversation when we're thinking about intersectionality. So I think that that's something that the Me Too movement has done really great in terms of how we are talking about it now. I also think that there's also Title IX in VAWA, right, has been re-signed. We're talking about even the protection in the collegial level of thinking about women's rights. But not only that, for example, when I was working at University of Arizona, one of my responsibilities was to start a survivors advocacy program, and just thinking about creating resources for students who have been impacted not by only sexual assault, but also gender-based violence, in order for us to be able to have a productive response that is actually telling the person, I believe what happened to you. Because I think what we're having with the Me Too movement, and again, is trying to shut down, make it invisible, make it so that that person can't talk about the violence and treatment that they received, and we need to stop that, right? And I think that that's what the Me Too movement has done, is you're not going to silence me.
With that, we're going to have to clear the stage, otherwise we're going to be extras in the next production. I want to thank Dr. McCarthy, Dean Rosario, and Dr. Reed for being a part of this. I believe we may be continuing. For those of you who would like to continue on a more informal basis, the conversation will all be next door at the Bound while they clear the theater, but I'm going to turn it over to Kate Alexander at this point,
Okay.
and she will give us direction.
So we want to take 1 minute with you all. You kept talking about expression over and over, and voice. The movement started without voice. It started with whispers. We knew that women were silent for centuries. Shakespeare, they couldn't even be in his plays or speak his plays till years after his death. Having agency in your word is one of the most important things we can do. So we want to end tonight thinking about the voice and the voiceless still yet to come. And we're going to hearken with Ariel Blue, and thanking Carolyn Michael as well, to that first anthem, the Battle Hymn of the Republic from the Civil War, that moved to the Abolitionist Battle Hymn, that moved to the Suffragist Project, suffragists who changed the words, to the Civil Rights Movement. And as we hear that ancient song, we think about the voiceless and the words needed. Thank you so much for your words tonight. And they're important that they're not just with community, but they're in forums like this and in the public domain where we can start to disseminate them and also stand with them and stand with you.
Rise up, women, for the fight is hard and long. rise up in thousands, singing loud a battle song. Right is might, and in strength we must be strong. The cause goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Oh, glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The cause goes marching on.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
I'm here with Yo Lady. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel today. Let me ask you, why is it so important to you to be a part of this panel and this project?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think when we're looking at the suffragist movement, there's always an absence of black voices and thinking about our contribution as people of color to these movements. And so I think being a part of the panel and thinking about the LGBTQ movement, thinking about the women's movement, even thinking about some of the things that the audience brought up, such as the Me Too movement, is just thinking about how, as a queer, trans person of color, and inserting that voice to make sure that we are being a part of the conversation. And I think that that's something that throughout history we have been kind of invisible. And so me participating, while I'm not speaking for every person of color, and I'm standing on the shoulders of giants and number of ancestors and legacies, I just wanted to make sure that we were a part of that and that I was bringing some of those names and voices to be visible as a part of the conversation, because there's a number of things that we've contributed throughout the years of history of this country, and those things need to be seen.
What would you like the audience members to be the biggest takeaway from this evening?
I think one of the biggest things that I think is thinking about those invisible voices, learning history and also its impact on our community, and also starting to think about how the issues that we're speaking about also include them, that they're a part of the narrative, they're a part of the conversation, they're a part of the community that has power to change and to get active and help us move the needle forward, so that everyone could be in a place where they're comfortable, where they feel safe, where there is true equality, where they're all within community, and that we're all feeling like we're being accepted and a part of a community that's larger than just one sort of a standalone issue. And I think that that's what I want them to take away, that they're also a part of this conversation and the agents that can help us change, that it can't be only the person who is marginalized or minoritized, that they're a part of this conversation.
Certainly. You mentioned a couple times this evening that you have been traveling all over the U.S. and experiencing all different types of cultures and have been received differently in different parts of the world. Yeah. Would you like to touch on that a little bit?
I think that everywhere I've been, there's definitely been bigotry or microaggressions or acts of violence that I've definitely faced, whether it is as a progressive space as in New York City to all the way to Arizona and Florida. I think that oftentimes we do picture or paint a place as negative or positive, but knowing that all of these places both have its beauty and its blessings, as well as things that people need to work on. So in Arizona, there was definitely a lot of work that we were putting in, from programming that we were doing to ensure that survivors of sexual assault and gender-based violence were getting equitable treatment or proper treatment, as well as a space that they can speak about some of the issues and the violence that they were being forced upon them. And so I think that there's a lot of things that I've seen. And in those, I've also found very amazing people who are doing so much amazing work, and that I wish that all of the negativity of each of those states or places that I've been to, I would say maybe perception of that place overshadows all of the great work and activism that's happening in those places. And I wish that we would be able to hear and see those sort of celebrating moments and those people who are doing so much work, because I think that that's where, I feel like I found community, I found beauty, and that's the reason why I love those places. I would never say I hate Arizona or I hate Florida or I hate anything else, because in those places there are some really beautiful people doing some amazing work, and I wish that we can talk about that and see that more.
So we flashed back 100 years tonight. Let's flash forward 100 years. What do you think that's going to look like?
I don't know what it would look like, because I think right now we're such in a space that I think it can go any which way. And I would hope that I would be out of a job in the next 100 years, that I would know that our institutions would no longer need diversity officers, that I could find something else to do with my life, because we're not struggling with racial issues, gender issues, any of those kind of class issues. You name the issue, and I would hope that in 100 years we can get it right as a community.
Eloquently said. Thank you so much for your thoughts this evening.
Thank you so much.
I'm sitting here with Starlet Massey. Starlet, you were in the audience this evening. What encouraged you to come this evening?
Well, I'm very interested in diversity and inclusion efforts and the different forums that we can utilize to spread this message and empower people to give everyone a sense of belonging. And Judge Williams told me about this event, so I was happy to make my way down from St. Petersburg.
Wonderful. And what were some of the strong takeaways from the dialogues up on stage this evening?
I have to say that as an attorney and someone who does study the feminist movement and diversity and inclusion issues, I learned a lot about our history, particularly, as to the early history of the suffragette movement, which was fascinating. But what really resonated with me this evening was this profound need to create a sense of belonging for everybody. I think the dean said it well when she was describing, that poignant personal moment and which bathroom would be available to use. And we have to do better for every, member of our society.
Funny but serious at the same time, she said, well, maybe I have to hold it because it's a general neutral bathroom at home. That kind of, really resonated with me, because we don't worry about that at home. We only worry about it in public, right?
Right. I just found it strikingly sad that anybody has to have that concern. And when we're talking about real concerns of violence on someone's person, just because of how they're presenting, we don't know everyone's story, both the visible differences and the invisible. And we need to all be better informed, because we need to learn how to show one another respect. I also thought it was really interesting, the one audience question about why people should care to learn about these issues and, create accommodations for people, I think the question was how she could help her coworker, decide whether or not they wanted to help. And there were a lot of words spoken that had a lot of meaning, but it came down to respect. And I still don't know how we truly answer that question. Yeah. How do you teach people how to care?
How do you teach people just to be kind and respect other people just because they are who they are, right? That's a hard thing for some people, I guess, to wrap their minds around.
It is.
Well, thank you so much for being here this evening and participating.
Thank you.
I'm here with Dr. Amy Reed. You were one of the panelists this evening. Wonderful, wonderful evening and conversation. Tell me a little bit about why you personally wanted to get involved and be a panelist in this topic.
So I guess part of it is I found when I was a younger student a lot of inspiration in the activism of feminist foremothers. And so I wanted to be able to talk about lessons I had learned from the way that they organized, from challenges that they faced and sometimes places where they stumbled, but also thinking about the lessons we can learn about opening our eyes and opening our minds to ways of connecting.
Absolutely. There was a word used this evening, intersectionality. Tell me a little bit about that from your perspective, because you specialize in gender studies.
Yes. Okay, so intersectionality, as they said in the panel, you can trace it to Kimberly Crenshaw using that term. But it really is a concept that goes much, much further back. And I mean, I hearken to Sojourner Truth as a person who first articulated in a very passionate way the ways that we can't separate out different aspects from our identity. When she says, "Ain't I a woman?" she's refusing to let people separate out the different aspects of who she was, her strength, her racial identity, her gender identity, all the challenges that she had faced as an enslaved person, and then as a free woman. And so the concept of intersectionality was used before the term was coined in women's studies courses. We talked about the Combahee River Collective. You can talk about Audre Lorde as another person who articulated well, both in her essays and in her poetry, the importance of understanding intersectionality, that we have different aspects of our identity and that we can't be asked to choose how we experience the world as an amalgam of things. So.
Wonderful. From your perspective, what do you hope the audience can take away tonight and ponder their heads on pillows?
I think the goal of this panel was to shift from talking about the suffrage movement as something that happened 100 years ago to talking about lessons for our contemporary society. And whether we're thinking about specifically LGBTQ issues, or whether we're just thinking about how we as individuals are going to face up to the political challenges of our day, I think we have a lot of lessons that we can learn about organization, about creativity, and about hopefulness despite challenges. And if we can hold on to those lessons from previous generations, I think hopefully we can continue moving ahead to the next century of challenges.
Speaking of, what do you hope the next 100 years looks like from this point? We flashed back 100 years. Let's flash forward 100 years.
That is a really challenging question to ask today. And I think that in terms of politics, in terms of challenges to our environment, it's not necessarily so easy to think about 100 years at the moment. And I think we have to do some reckonings for the immediate and not shy away from addressing problems that are really challenging our ability to continue to exist on this planet.
I'm sitting down with Judge Williams, the moderator for this evening's panel discussion. What were you hoping that the audience could take away from the conversations that happened this evening?
Well, in all of these conversations, and I've been involved in quite a few at Florida Studio Theater, we want to make it a comfortable environment for people to exchange ideas and thoughts. Some of the ideas and thoughts may not be particularly politically, for want of a better word, correct. They may feel sensitive talking about it, but we want to create an environment where we can have these types of discussions, because in order to solve problems, you first have to talk about them. And so that's our goal, to talk about them first.
Just get them out in the air.
Yes.
Why did you want to be a part of this project?
Well, you know, the 19th Amendment, although it did not apply to African Americans who actually got the right to vote as men by the 15th Amendment years earlier, any type of movement for social justice resonates with me, whether it's the right to vote, whether it's the right to assemble, whether it's freedom of speech. Any type of social justice movement, and the suffragist movement was a social justice movement like the civil rights movement, resonates with me personally. And so I was instantly attracted to the stories of these women, the fact that they were physically assaulted for just even trying to vote, and placed in jails for even trying to vote, which sort of was a similar track to what was happening in the civil rights movement in this country in the early part of the 20th century. So the story resonated with me, and I wanted to be a part of it.
Where do you hope that this story ends?
Well, I hope that by understanding how difficult it was just for certain people to vote, that from a very elementary point, people will actually vote. 2020 is going to be a very important election for this country. We hope that people who have earned the right to vote on the backs of people who have sacrificed will certainly now take it more seriously. Those who've come here, those who've discussed this issue now should understand why one vote is so important, even from a symbolic point of view, for supporting these women and the things that they did.
Absolutely. Very well said.